very condensed version of what I gave to Nancy and Sujit to read, is probably going to be the second chapter of a book that I'm writing on the history of ornithology in Sri Lanka. And it's part of a trilogy of chapters. I should say, just, I should start by saying that the abstract that was circulated is a little bit misleading, because I had said I'm going to be talking about a fellow named Leg. And as it turns out, I'm not really going to say very much about Leg, because he is the subject of the next chapter of this book, which has also been drafted. I'm mostly going to focus my attention on a period between the early 1840s and about 1853, in which the scientific study of birds, as it had developed in Western Europe, was transferred to Sri Lanka and became established in Sri Lanka. So that's really going to be the focus of this paper. Let's see now, okay, how we advance it. The framework for the paper and the kind of the general framework for the book are the ideas of a historian of science named George Basaya, who is well known to people who study the history of how science was transferred, of how science spread to the world outside Western Europe. That is to say, modern science, the kind of science that we understand as science today. And Basaya wrote this paper called The Spread of Western Science back in 1967, in which he proposed a tripartite model. And Basaya's argument is that science diffused from its origins in a very narrow circle of countries in Western Europe to the rest of the world in three phases. These are overlapping phases, obviously. They are not as if one phase ends and the next phase begins, but they're overlapping phases. And the first phase is a sort of extractive phase, where you have Europeans going out, they're going out to trade, they're going out to explore, they're finding curious objects in foreign places, they're bringing them back to Europe. And these objects can be natural history specimens, they can also be cultural artifacts, but you have this craze for collecting that is emerging in Europe, and these objects help to fuel that craze. So you have the idea of cabinets of curiosities. And then you have the development of what he calls colonial science. And what he means by colonial science is that as European empires begin to form, science begins to be conducted in those places, right? But they are conducted, they're colonial because they are dependent on the metropole. People seek their inspiration from what's going on back home. They depend on what's going back at home for reference material, for resources, for ideas, for institutions, for journals, and so on. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, and people are welcome to ask at question time because there's a lot of material to cover here. The final phase in Basaya's model is what he terms the struggle to achieve an autonomous scientific tradition. Where in those colonies that are now becoming independent states, you have attempts to create a science that is independent of the apron strings of the metropole, right? Places that begin to develop their own institutions, their own journals, their own scientists who are oriented to their own countries rather than to the outside. So that's sort of the framework. And, these are very fruitful ideas, but they have been critiqued over the years by others who have pointed out some of the things that Basaya didn't talk about. For example, how are these ideas received in the countries, in the places to which they are being diffused, right? How do Indians and Sri Lankans and Malays and Chinese and Japanese, what do they make of these ideas when these ideas show up on their doorstep? And what is the role played by people in the colonies, not Europeans, but the colonized, in the creation of this kind of science? So that's an aspect of the critique that has been made of Basaya's ideas. And to be fair, Basaya says that this is simply a heuristic device that he has come up with in order to spur conversation, which indeed it has. The second point I want to make in the next part of this slide is simply to draw your attention to three periods to the discovery of species. And this talk is really going to be about the discovery of species, avian species, birds. You might recognize the illustration because it's from Master and Commander. If any of you ever saw that movie, which is probably the best, Patrick O'Brien's novels are probably the best example of the early extractive period scientist in the person of Stephen Maturin, the ship's doctor who you see here in the Galapagos. But there are three periods to the discovery of species. What Robert Kohler, American historian of science, calls the Linnaean, which is the second half of the 18th century. And once Linnaeus's ideas of classification came to be adopted, there was a sort of scramble to discover species and name them. And a lot of these species, of course, were found in cabinets of curiosities, in the collections amassed by wealthy people, even by middle-class people, of these birds and reptiles and mammals and what have you to populate their exhibition cabinets. So that's the first phase. The second phase, more or less, is from the 1830s to the 1850s, which coincides also with the beginnings of colonialism. And then the last phase is from the 1880s to about the 1920s, the heyday of colonialism. And colonialism is tied by the hip to the emergence of, certainly the emergence of zoology, geology, and so on. Okay, so these are the three phases. This paper is mostly going to be about the middle phase, the 1830s to the 1850s. So here's an example of what I mean by this extractive phase. This is a bird. It's known as the Eclectus parrot. And it first appears in the literature of science in the paper that you see here by Vosmeer, who was the curator of the private collection of the Prince of Orange in the Netherlands. Right? The Prince of Orange had a large private collection. There was this bird. And according to Vosmeer, this bird was from Ceylon. That's where people thought the bird came from. Eclectus parrots, however, are found in the East Indies, in what is today Eastern Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Melanesian islands, which you see on the map. This particular bird is a female Eclectus parrot of a subspecies found here in the northern Moluccas, right, marked 1. How does it come to be identified with Ceylon? That I think is pretty self-evident. The Dutch ruled Moluccas, that's the Spice Islands. The bird was probably put on a ship, captured in the Moluccas, put on a ship, ended up in Ceylon, was traded to somebody in Ceylon, who in turn traded it to somebody on their way back to Amsterdam or wherever. And that's how it got there. But of course, nobody knew what its provenance was. They just assumed it was from Ceylon. So as you can see, knowing the provenance of an object, natural history object, is a vital aspect of doing science. But that wasn't happening at this particular stage in history. You were just collecting stuff, okay? So that's, and there are lots and lots of examples like this. So another example from this period, which links up Sri Lanka, is perhaps the first naturalist that we know of in Sri Lanka, Gideon Lawton, who was the governor of Sri Lanka from 1752 to 1757. He was posted from Batavia to clean up a mess left by his predecessor. He was very interested in natural history, but as his biographer says, he was interested in natural history not from the angle of being a scientist, but from for his own amusement. And he is known as the naturalist governor of Ceylon for his contributions to natural history at the birth of zoology. And one of those contributions is that he recruited a painter by the name of Peter de Bevier, who was probably of mixed Dutch and Sri Lankan origin, to paint for him specimens of natural history, like the one you see here. This is the red-faced Malkoha. And what is really important about this contribution is that these paintings, this is what made Lawton's reputation. So when Lawton retired and went home to Europe, he took all these paintings with him. They are all now in the British Museum of Natural History. There are about 150 of them. 101 of them are of birds. And these paintings were used by the authors of the books that you see on this slide to illustrate some of the very earliest textbooks that were published that laid the grounds for the emergence of modern zoology later on. Right? So these are illustrations of random animals and reptiles and mammals and so on. So you can see here, so Sri Lanka is present in a sense at the birth of modern zoology. At least Sri Lanka's zoology is here. Okay, so moving along very quickly. How does ornithology begin in Sri Lanka? And one of the things I'm arguing is that ornithology begin, the catalyst for the emergence of ornithology in Sri Lanka is this person, Edward Blyth, one of the most important but least known zoologists of the 19th century. And another thing that I'm arguing is that contrary to Basaya, who focuses on the relationship between the periphery and the metropole, Calcutta plays a very important role, a much more important role than London, in catalyzing the development of a colonial science of ornithology in Sri Lanka, thanks to Blyth. So Blyth was born and raised in England, obviously, but he was not from the privileged classes in England. His father was a tradesman. He didn't have much money. This is at a period when naturalists, to be a scientist, meant really that you had to have an independent means of income. Rich people were scientists because they had the money and the time to be scientists. Poor people could not really support themselves to do science. So there were few options for someone like Blyth to earn a living in England, right? You could be a curator in a museum, but there weren't that many museums. You could be a professor in a university, but you needed to have an education to do that. Blyth had never went to the university. His big break came when the Royal Asiatic Society in Calcutta invited him to be the curator of its museum. And he took them up on the offer. He was very poorly paid, but he went out to Calcutta in 1841, stayed in Calcutta for 22 years. He was determined to make something of the Calcutta Museum, and he did. So the museum in Calcutta, during the time that Blyth was its curator, became one of the most important places to do zoological work outside Western Europe and North America, right? Calcutta, that was the place. And what Blyth wanted to do, to give you an example of Blyth's efforts, between 1841 and 1847, the ornithological collection of bird specimens in the Calcutta Museum went from 600 to 4,400. So he did an immense amount of work, and he also reached out to places like Sri Lanka, which was not represented in the Calcutta Museum. And in order to do that, he saw Sri Lanka as being an important part of Indian zoology. And the reason for that is that the zoology of Sri Lanka is essentially an extension of the zoology of the Western Ghats, right, of the western coast of India. It sort of extends down into Sri Lanka, which used to be connected to India 25 or 30,000 years ago before separation occurred. And so because Sri Lanka is an island, the zoology has evolved in somewhat different directions. So there is a high degree of endemicity in Sri Lanka, meaning species not found anywhere else in the world, bird species, reptiles, amphibians, all of them. So Sri Lanka becomes an object of interest to zoologists, and it becomes a vital part of Indian zoology. And Blyth wants to include this in the Calcutta Museum. So what he does is he tries to recruit people in Sri Lanka to collect for him. And the first person he contacts, so there are 4 people. I'll just run through their names very quickly. There is Robert Templeton. Robert Templeton is a surgeon in the Royal Artillery. He is the son of a very distinguished family of naturalists back home in Ireland. His father, John Templeton, is called the doyen of Irish natural history. He was a botanist. Templeton is not really interested in birds. He's interested in insects and butterflies, but he collects birds for Blyth. He doesn't shoot, however. He doesn't use a gun. He's not comfortable with guns. So he gets other people to do it for him. And one of the other people who does it for him is the person who is the most significant person that I discuss in this paper. And this is Edgar Leopold Layard. And Layard comes from a family well known in Sri Lanka. There have been civil servants, judges with the name Layard in Sri Lanka. Layard grows up in England. He's born in Italy, grows up in England. He doesn't have too many options. He comes out to Sri Lanka in order to be a coffee planter. But before he actually arrives in Colombo, the coffee plantation fails. And so he and his wife end up without a job. They are sort of, impecunious, and they run into Templeton. Actually, Layard falls ill. Templeton comes to attend to him. Templeton discovers that Layard, like him, is interested in butterflies and insects, and he becomes very friendly with Layard. And he recruits, Layard likes to shoot. Layard is a hunter. So he recruits Layard to shoot birds for him. Layard, thanks to meeting up with an accidental meeting with a judge who persuades Layard to become a magistrate. The fact that Layard doesn't know anything about the law doesn't matter. The judge says to him, just go pass the bar exam, which Layard does. He's made a magistrate. He is sent to Point Pedro in Jaffna, and he spends most of his career, or much of his career, in the Jaffna Peninsula collecting, right? So one of the points, I also want to say something about Layard's wife. His wife, Annie Layard, is herself a naturalist. She is a very good botanist. She's also a very good painter and artist. Unfortunately, she illustrated fish that Layard collected in Sri Lanka, but unfortunately, she doesn't seem to have done anything with birds, or if she did, they didn't survive. Layard named this parakeet, Layard's parakeet, for his wife. The scientific name is Calthropei, which is the family name of his wife. So Sitacula calthropei is Layard's parakeet named for Annie Layard. So this slide, I just threw this up to show you how Layard was introduced to ornithology. When Templeton was an army surgeon, he was recalled to England in 1851 because of the Crimean War that was showing up on the horizon. He spent the rest of his career serving in the Crimean War. When he left, he turned Blight's responsibilities over to Layard. Unfortunately, Layard says that he and Blight corresponded every month. There was regular letters back and forth between these two men. Very sadly and unfortunately for me, at any rate, these letters don't seem to have survived, which is too bad. So Layard's introduction to ornithology comes like this. The other point that I want to make, because I'll return to it later, is that Layard had a rather tense relationship with this person, the last member of Blight's Sri Lankan crew. So Blight had Templeton, Layard, and Kellart. And Kellart is interesting and significant for a number of reasons. Kellart has been described by Sri Lankans as the father of Sri Lankan zoology. He was a man of very eclectic interest in natural history. I mean, he was interested in everything: birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, geology, botany, marine invertebrates. He wrote extensively on the pearl fishery. So he covered a lot of ground. He was the author of this book, Prodromus, which literally means a beginning. And this is the foundation of all of the work in zoology that happened later on, because what Kellart does here is he lists out all of the species of animals found in Sri Lanka: mammals, birds, reptiles. But the other interesting thing about Kellart is that he's a Sri Lankan, which is very unusual in colonial science of this period. He's a Sri Lankan because his grandfather arrived in Sri Lanka in 1726, settled in Sri Lanka. Kellart is of impeccable European genetic heritage. And I make that point because it's important for, I think, for some of the story that I want to tell. So Kellart is genetically a European. He's not of mixed origin like, say, Peter de Bevier was. His mother is German, his father is Dutch, but he's born and raised in Sri Lanka. And I think that handicaps him, because for the British, when they showed up in Sri Lanka and took it over from the Dutch, they tended to despise the Dutch who had stayed behind. And you can see this if you read some of those early British authors, like, for example, Robert Percival, who is very disparaging about the Dutchman that he finds in Colombo. And also the English of the 19th century referred to Europeans born in the colonies, born in Sri Lanka, even as late as the late 19th century, as country bottled, which was a pejorative term. To be called country bottled meant that you were kind of low down in the caste hierarchy of colonial society. And so Kelat is undoubtedly country bottled. And this may have something to do with some of the other things that I want to talk about. So Kelat also works for Layard. Kelat is the first Sri Lankan to be trained as a doctor in the Western tradition. He joins the army as a military doctor in Colombo. He serves with the Highland Regiment. When the regiment leaves to go back to Scotland, he accompanies them. And like Templeton, he ends up at the University of Edinburgh to be trained as a doctor and a surgeon, but also, and this is the other important thing, the University of Edinburgh at this time was a real center for training people to be natural history collectors. They produced large numbers of doctors and surgeons who joined the East India Company and so on, and went on to be natural history collectors. So Kelat is the first doctor. He's trained at Edinburgh. He comes back to Sri Lanka. His interest in natural history must come from his family. While he's in Edinburgh, his father sends him collections of Sri Lankan birds, right? And he is able, because he's in England, to identify these birds by referring to the books, by going to the museum and so on, and that sort of gives him a knowledge base. One last thing I'll mention about Kelat before I move on is that Kelat is known for making a number of errors in naming species. He does what is called create vertebrate synonyms. Creating vertebrate synonyms means you find an animal, you don't know what the animal is, you give the animal a name, but somebody else has already discovered this species and given it a name, right? So you're creating synonyms that can be confusing. And the reason, of course, that this happens is because in Sri Lanka, there aren't any books, there aren't any reference books, there aren't reference collections, there aren't any museums, so there's no way of knowing what knowledge has already been created. That is something that people in the metropole have, right? Not just in the metropole, in London have, but not people in the colonies. So much for Kelat. I've got to sort of rush through the rest of this because time is kind of tight. This is the last person. This is Legg. I'm not really going to talk about Legg except to say Legg's an Australian. He's a lieutenant in the Royal Artillery when he arrives in Sri Lanka. And unlike the other three people I've mentioned, he's actually a wealthy man because his family has a very large estate in Tasmania. So he's got a lot of resources that allows him to do ornithology. I just want to explain this map to you as a way of commenting on the importance of colonies to ornithological research. So I created this map simply by dropping a pin down on every spot in Sri Lanka where Legg said he collected birds in his book, A History of the Birds of Ceylon. And just to explain this map to you, ornithological research and zoological research follow imperialism. And it does so for two ways that imperialism, there must be more ways, but two significant ways. One is imperialism obviously expands control of territory that allows you to go into certain places. And it does so, allows you to go into certain places by creating roads, right? And Sri Lanka, unlike many British colonies, had good roads early on. Right, the British set out to create a road network. And you can see the way Legg uses this road network. So when Legg comes, he is, sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. He is stationed in Colombo for 2 years, and he does work around Colombo. His unit is then sent to Gaul, and he uses Gaul as a base of operations to explore the surrounding area. His unit is then sent to Trinco, and he uses Trincomalee in the same way. So Trincomalee is a base of operations to explore the East Coast. But also the other thing that colonialism did in Sri Lanka is to create coffee plantations, the whole coffee economy. And the coffee economy opened up the interior of the country, which is also the most zoologically interesting part of the country. And you can see here how Legg made use of the coffee plantations to explore the interior. This U shape here maps almost exactly onto coffee plantations. So you have the Candian coffee growing region, then you have the Bogavantalawa and the Dimbula coffee growing regions down here. And then along the eastern flank of the hills is the Uva coffee growing district. So Legg is following this and taking advantage of the hospitality of coffee planters, which was legendary. One last thing about Legg, when he traveled between Colombo and Trinco, he traveled in a bullock cart, which proceeded at about 10 or 12 miles per hour, giving him plenty of time to collect along the way, right? So I'm going to move on, but that's just by way of illustrating the way colonialism and ornithology intersect. That's Legg's flower pecker, bird that he discovered and which is named for him. All right, what does doing ornithology actually mean in the 19th century? It means more than anything else, collecting specimens. You collect the specimens, you have to prepare the skin, you have to preserve the skin, you collect eggs, you collect nests, if you're in the colonies, you then have to parcel these things up and ship them off either to Calcutta or to London. One of the differences between collecting now and collecting in Bosmer's time, you have to label everything, right? And there are efforts to get people to label things properly. Where did you collect this bird? At what elevation? Were you able to discover if their birds share the same, the male and female have the same plumage, whether this was a male or whether this was a female? All kinds of stuff should go on the label. And then you have to identify it. That's a key challenge. And then on the side, you also do things like collect distributional data, you collect information on habits, nesting, and so on. But that is seen as secondary to the museum ornithologists, who are the real scientists in this enterprise. Okay, so this is what doing ornithology means. I threw this in. This is an excerpt. I thought you might be interested in seeing the technology and also seeing the social context of doing this kind of work. This is from Layard. He wrote 4 articles about a trip he made from Jaffna to Kandy and back again on the new Jaffna-Kandy road. It's called Rambles in Ceylon. It appears in a magazine called Annals and Magazines of Natural History. So it tells you something about the technology he's using. But I've also highlighted something I want to talk about at the end of his talk, which is his Sri Lankan assistant, a man called Muthu, right? Whom he refers to as his man Friday, which is a very colonial kind of description, to be the man Friday of the European ornithologist. But I'm going to come back to Muthu and talk a bit more about him. Besides actually shooting specimens, there were a couple of other ways in which people, ornithologists in Sri Lanka, got specimens. One was to network with hunters. So one of the principal forms of recreation for Europeans in colonial Ceylon, especially for coffee planters, was to hunt, right? Because you had complete liberty and freedom to go out and shoot. There were no restrictions, no game laws, no property restrictions, none of that. And you could acquire specimens from hunters. If they shot something interesting, if you were networked with them, they would send it to you or they would keep it for you. Hunters is one way. The other way is through taxidermy shops, which are very important in the 19th century for natural history. So in Sri Lanka, there were several taxidermy shops. This is one by a man named Lazarus, a Tamil gentleman in Union Place, Colombo, who had a taxidermy shop. Lazarus was networked. He provided specimens to the museum in Prague. If you were an ornithologist visiting Colombo, you would go into Lazarus's shop to see what it was that he had. So a taxidermy shop was a place to find specimens, and Lazarus would buy specimens from hunters because he had some expectation of reselling them to a collector and making a bit of profit. And these people are all networked. So here's an address book published in Germany for naturalists. And it goes country by country, and it tells you who in this country is interested in what, so that you can communicate with them and see if they can provide you with specimens. So you'll see that in Colombo, for example, in Kandy, you have G. Jacobs, who is a taxidermist, so you could write to Jacobs. In Colombo, you have Lazarus, who's a dealer in animals, and so on and so forth. So these people are really well networked. But there are certain challenges to doing ornithology at this period. And this is why it's still a sort of a colonial science, right? And it hasn't emerged as an independent science. As I said, with respect to Kellart, one of the principal challenges is a lack of reference materials. How do you identify what you've seen? You need the big manuals, you need the big catalogs that are produced in places like the British Museum, but you can't afford them. If you're just a private person like Kellart or Layard, who don't have a lot of extra cash in their pocket, Legg could do that, because I said Legg was independently wealthy. Layard and Kellart couldn't. So when you read their stuff, they're always complaining about how they can't lay their hand on the books that they need to do the work that they want to do. So there's a lack of reference. Oops, now I don't know what happened there. Let's get back to, okay. Am I back? Oh, I'm back in business. Not only do they lack books, they lack reference materials. What I mean by reference materials is that they lack extensive skin collections. Right? Because that's how you identify stuff. You have skins. You've got the British Museum. They've got thousands of skins. So if you're there, it's easy to get your work done. If you're in Sri Lanka, where there is no museum, it's challenging, even if you've got a little personal collection of your own. There are no libraries. There are no scientific institutes or associations. And most of all, there are no journals in which to publish. You want to publish, you've got to send it back to England. I know that well, I'll come back to that hopefully in question time, because I'm under the gun here a little bit in the time thing. So one of the things that happens in the 19th century in Sri Lanka, and happens relatively early, which I think makes Sri Lanka a little bit different from many other parts of the world, is that some of these shortcomings get addressed. So a branch of the Royal Asiatic Society is established in 1845. And it is at the inception, it has one Sri Lankan. That's a Dutch burgher, J.N. Muyat, who is a member of the, but a few years later, that number has grown to 9. And then as the years progress, more and more Sri Lankans. So the Royal Asiatic Society actually happens to be one of a handful of organizations in colonial Ceylon that admitted Sri Lankans early on. Other organizations didn't. I mean, the Sri Lankans were excluded. There was a strong sort of color bar, and we can come back to that in question time if anybody is interested. But a thing that the Royal Asiatic Society also did was to publish a journal and create a library, a rather moth-eaten library, not a library, sorry, a moth-eaten museum. It wasn't a very good museum, but at least they tried. They created a library, but the library wasn't very good for ornithologists because it mostly had stuff on antiquities and history and literature and dictionaries and stuff like that, and not really anything on zoology. And by the end of the 19th century, the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society had published 25 papers on birds. Most of them were by Kellart, Layard, Legg, and a handful of others. In the 20th century, the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society only published one paper on birds, which shows you how its importance had declined. Now there were other journals to publish in, and there were actually other institutions, including the Colombo Museum, which provided a home for ornithological research. So the Colombo Museum was established in 1877, and that was because Governor Gregory, who arrived in the island in around that time, was a big fan of museums. So when the Royal Asiatic Society approached him and said, Colombo doesn't have a proper museum and the government needs to help, he was ready and willing to step into the breach, and that's why Colombo has a museum. Now, the question that I want to come back to and end my talk here is the one that Basaya leaves unexamined, which is, what do Sri Lankans make of all of this activity? Well, what most Sri Lankans make of all of this activity doesn't really matter, because they are not involved in ornithology. They don't care less about ornithology. They don't know any ornithologists. What they think about this activity is probably illustrated in this excerpt from a letter that Layard wrote to a friend of his in England, right, which was published in this magazine. You know, if Sri Lankans, ordinary Sri Lankans thought about what they were doing, this is probably what they thought about. Sorry. But there are more important I don't know what is going on here. Okay. There are more important Sri Lankans, however, whose attitudes we should be curious about. And one of them is Muttu. That is to say, the people who are most intimately associated with the ornithologists as their collectors, as their, you know, sidekicks, so to speak. You might wonder why I've got a picture of Aeneas and Achates in the middle of this slide. And the reason I have that picture is because Layard, in one article, refers to Muttu as his fidus Achates. And Achates, of course, as you know, is Aeneas's sidekick and Aeneas's close friend in the Aeneid. And that's curious, that's interesting, because elsewhere, of course, Muttu is his man Friday. That's a proper colonial relationship. But to call him your fidus Achates indicates a different kind of relationship, which is also reinforced by the fact that here you see the brown-breasted flycatcher, whose scientific name is Muscicapa muttui. In other words, Layard named the flycatcher for his servant, Muttu. And I think this is because, well, obviously Layard had a very high opinion of Muttu's abilities, right? And an illustration of that, but which is also an illustration of the way Muttu might have been thinking about ornithology, is illustrated in the two photographs of birds that you see on either side. So on the left side, you see a bird known as the oriental pied hornbill, which is a North Indian bird. It is not found in Sri Lanka. It is not found in South India. On the right, you see the Malabar pied hornbill. If you've ever been out in the dry zone in Uddawala Way or Vilpattu or a place like that, you will have seen Malabar pied hornbills, right? And you can see that these birds very closely resemble each other. I let you figure out in what 2 points these birds are distinct. But what is important here is that Layard, he says, I saw an oriental pied hornbill, but I am not including it in the Ceylon list because I was unable to shoot it. And I know it was an oriental pied hornbill because Blythe sent me the skins of oriental pied hornbills. So I could compare what I saw to the skin, and that's how I know, right? But I'm not putting it on the list because I don't have a skin. And the skin is how you document what you see. But then he supports this by saying, what is more, Muttu saw it. Because Muttu saw it and Muttu came and described it to me, and it matches up perfectly with what I saw. So that's one reason to hold Muttu in high regard, because Muttu is a Sri Lankan. And in terms of Muttu's own cultural background, people are classifying birds in a very different way, right? But he is now attuned to the way these Europeans are thinking about the birds. And he knows enough about the way Europeans are thinking about the birds to know that those subtle points of difference are actually significant. So I think that is important. And along with this, Layard didn't trust Kellart's identification. So Layard trusts Muttu, but he doesn't trust Kellart. He says Kellart makes all kinds of mistakes. And I said that I'm going to stop here. He says that's the obligatory sunset, in case any of you are curious. I think you're all supposed to end on a sunset. So there's your sunset. But what I want to say about Kellart and Layard is that there was a great deal of antagonism between them, or at least the antagonism is on Layard's side. Layard actually, 20 years later, he refers to Kellart as being stupid, right? Because Kellart got the name of something that Layard had named wrong. Rather undiplomatic. He says everywhere in all of his writing, you can't really trust Kellart's identifications. Kellart got this wrong, Kellart got that wrong. And the reason for this antagonism, which he seems to hold on to 20 years later, long after Kellart has died, and he's gone on to fame and success, happens to be that he and Kellart had apparently agreed that Kellart would produce a second volume of Prodromus about the birds, which Layard would write, and Kellart didn't. And instead of doing that, Kellart stuck in a checklist for Sri Lankan birds into the volume of Prodromus that he actually did produce. And this seems to have really rubbed Layard up the wrong way. Now, we only have Layard's version of the story because we don't really know what Kellart thought about it all. But so I'll end on this by sort of speculating that part of what made Layard so to sort of hold on to this grudge, if you will, is the fact that Kellart was this colonial person who had, in the context of Sri Lanka, really kind of eclipsed him as a naturalist. I don't know if that's a fair assessment or not, but I'm kind of trying, why is there this antagonism to Kellart? And I can't sort of think of anything else. So I'll stop there because I've gone for longer than I meant to, and open it up to questions. And I'm sorry, I think I went 10 minutes over.
That's quite all right. Thank you, Arjun. So first we're going to have our first formal response from Sujit Sivasundaram. And just as a reminder to everyone in the audience, if you do have questions for Arjun, please just indicate your interest to ask a question in the chat, and then during the discussion period, I'll call on you. So I will now turn over to Sujit for the first response.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry I was a bit late because I got the time wrong. I thought it was at 4 p.m. UK, but actually turned out to be that the clocks, as usual in England, done something unusual and changed. Well, I knew this already, but I've miscalculated. So thank you very much, Arjun, for sharing your work. And these comments are actually based more on the written paper because I missed some of the oral presentation, sadly. And thanks to John as well for this invitation. So when John wrote to ask me to comment, in one of those weird coincidences, I had actually been working on the history of the Colombo Museum over the last few months. And I'd also been looking at the bird collection and also the snake collection. So I immediately dropped that research because I hadn't known about your work, Arjun. And so I haven't worked on it since John wrote to me. And so it was a real pleasure to engage with this empirically rich account which you present in the written paper, which you sent me. Thank you. So taking a step back, I come to this as someone who did their PhD in the history of science. And it's noticeable that there's currently a surge of work within history of science connected to Sri Lanka. There was a paper earlier in this series on the pearl fisheries as a site of knowledge, labor, and statecraft, approached from attention to the entanglement of, in a wonderful phrase, men and mollusks. There is a forthcoming book by Bernard Shah at Zurich on Paul Saracen and Fritz Saracen, the Swiss naturalists, with substantial material on Sri Lanka. There is work afoot by another colleague here in Cambridge, Daniel Macoxey, on shipbuilding in Sri Lanka in the Dutch era, and one could go on and on. So one might ask why this is happening. So my answer would be that the island has consistently, through the early modern and modern eras, attracted theorists of nature, given that it's a biodiverse site on travel routes at the center of the Indian Ocean. This is so, of course, not only for natural science, but also with respect to other fields too. And one can think, for instance, of anthropology and perhaps also Oriental studies and religion, where Sri Lanka has played a vital role in the history of these fields. If we are to come to terms with this, however, we need to consider, and Arjun has been commenting on this as well today, the politics of this knowledge. So historians of Western science have for 30 or more years now been deeply concerned with placing science at the heart of colonization and as a set of linguistic and imaginative tools that order nature, together with society, consolidating such concepts as race and gender, for instance. More recently, this has given way to a big push ongoing at present in various departments of the history of science to decolonize the field. meaning to move the story beyond colonial science to modes of knowledge which are Asian, for instance, and which could in turn destabilize the narrative of the rise of Western science. So Arjun presents us with a devoted account of the rise of ornithology, and I call it devoted because he really does know what it means to study birds, and so is able to interpret the history with the requisite technical skill. He also gives us a rich account of the networks of people, and I noticed the word network, Arjun, which you're using again in your oral presentation, really the networks of people involved in the making of this science and their biographies, linking, for instance, the Dutch era to the British one. And it's especially valuable to see the attention to Lankan intermediaries who worked alongside the colonial ornithologists. So there was this group of men, the Blythes, the Lairds, the Templetons, and so on. But Blythe, for instance, if I understand correctly, didn't even visit the island. In this context, one really does see that much of this collecting and knowledge gathering relied on local labor, information, and skill. And of course, it was particularly striking once again to hear about Muttu today, rendered as Man Friday in that colonial rendition, who accompanied Laird with rifle in hand. So I immediately wondered why Laird gets the privilege of being termed an ornithologist. And so it's interesting to see that, which I didn't know because I don't think it was in the paper, that a bird was named after Muttu as well. The contribution that Arjun makes also lies in how he rightly critiques existent literature for not paying sufficient attention to the role of Calcutta in fostering ornithological or broader scientific work in a place like Sri Lanka. And this is very much in keeping with how others as well have sought to think of the emergence of this kind of scientific knowledge across different sites of South Asia, and not only between, say, London and South Asia. So now for some questions. One thing that really struck me in working through the records of the collection of birds in the Colombo Museum in the later 19th century is the persistent attention to themes such as region, province, and migration. Plotting birds was certainly about plotting the geography of Sri Lanka, but the language and terminology was surprisingly close to that used for people. Even the term cosmopolitan appeared in one instance. So I wondered if Arjun could approach this material not only from the consolidation of a science of ornithology, but also from what ornithology means for understandings of society in Sri Lanka. Asking the same question with other words, and this follows your comment, Arjun, which I heard about colonization. What precisely is the power relation here, given that many of the early ornithologists and their guns, in fact, arise from a military context and a military career? If we are to decolonize the story, it would be really important to know more about the thought worlds and placement of people like Muttu or the Sinhalese Appu, who is also mentioned alongside Muttu. And one stray idea that came to my mind in reading the material of the Colombo Museum is whether it would be fruitful to think of the Sandesha Kavi, for instance. For those who don't know, Sandesha Kavi are a genre of poetry narrated from the perspective of a bird in flight. How more broadly are birds narrated in Lankan literary culture and history? And why do they feature so heavily in artistic and sculptural traditions? And what would it mean to approach colonial ornithology from such a perspective rather than only from the colonial ornithological figures who might easily feature? Personally, I would also be keen to think in much more materialist ways about what is occurring here. And so it was interesting hearing you talk about this, Arjun, meaning not simply the abstracted knowledge of the bird, but how birds are killed, how they're stuffed, how they are arranged. So I was listening to a fascinating presentation recently from a museum studies scholar on why bird displays are so deeply gendered in the 19th century, with the male bird, male stuffed bird, always displayed over and leading the female stuffed bird, and how this is something that we have taken to be normal up to the present. So these displays still exist undisturbed. If we're to break apart this science into its practical skills, we may then come to a more dispersed account of it, which includes a whole series of people like Muttu. And in other words, we will be able to work across the divides of race and gender. But we may also be able to think about the labor behind this knowledge and how in turn it was consumed by a public audience, such as those people who visited museums. Indeed, when I read Legg's A History of the Birds of Ceylon, 1878, some months ago, I noted a distinct desire on his part to communicate this information. So it'd be interesting to know what really the consumption, if at all, there was of this knowledge is, so that we can move beyond the elite theorist. If we go down this route, it's not only the museum which becomes a significant site, but also the collection of visual materials. So indeed, the art that accompanies many of Arjun's sources is totally absorbing. And so one would want to know, what is going on with the art and where it goes and who is drawing it up as well. And actually kind of thinking back to some earlier work that I did, the botanical illustrations of the early period are, Harmanis Tiavis and Guneratne turns out to be one of the key figures. And so one gets to actually the artistic tradition, taking me down a route, which is more Lankan in turn. So thank you, Arjun, for opening up a really understudied area. And I should say that it's really important work because it provides also a deeper appreciation of Sri Lanka's natural history at a time, of course, when we're facing an era of extinctions in turn. So thanks for that as well.
Well, Sujit, thank you very much for that. Was a very rich commentary. I've jotted down what you said, and I think you've given me actually a number of avenues to go down in order to, to expand on the work that I'm doing. I'm not going to be able to get to everything that you pointed. I'll just pick out some of the things that I can answer quickly and easily. The military angle is actually very interesting because if you look at, for example, if you take the Bombay Natural History Society journal, and that journal is founded about the early 1880s. You'll see that between its founding and well into the 20th century, about the 1930s, I think, at least a third, if not even half in some issues of the contributions are from military people. And so, you have all of these British military people who are serving in India, writing in and sending articles about birds, insects, reptiles, what have you. And part of the explanation for this has been put forward by a historian named Christine Greer, who says that in the middle of the 19th century, in the military academy at Woolwich, not Sandhurst, but there was a military academy at Woolwich, the curriculum included taxidermy. So if you were an officer cadet planning a career in the army, among learning gunnery and everything else that you were supposed to learn to be a good soldier, you also had to learn taxidermy. And the explanation for this is that the British Army encouraged its soldiers, its officers rather, not its ordinary soldiers, but its officers to engage in intellectual pursuits like natural history or archaeology or whatever it was when they were not on active service. Right? So if you're not on active service, you apparently had a great deal of leisure time, especially if you were from a well-to-do family, which pretty much describes the British officer corps in the 19th century, because this is a period when, you're buying commissions and things like that. So it means you've got money. And leg, actually, one of the reasons leg was, I don't know if you were here when I showed the map, but one of the reasons that leg was able to explore Sri Lanka so thoroughly, much more than either Kellart or Layard, is because he had loads of leisure. Because Sri Lanka was not a, it was not a challenging post if you were an army man. You kind of kicked back and there was nothing much to do except go out and hunt. And so Leg spent every moment of his spare time pursuing his interest, encouraged by the army. And the army also encouraged Kellart and Templeton, right? Except that they were busier because they were surgeons, so they actually had stuff to do, but in their leisure time. So I think that's part of the explanation for for why military people figure so prominently. Why are birds gendered? I think that's a fascinating question that I haven't actually looked at. Now that you've raised it, I think I'm going to be thinking about it much more deeply. One possible prosaic response to the question that you posed, I think, in terms of museums and the public, is that, in bird life, the male bird tends to be much more colorful and have a more gorgeous plumage than the female bird, right? The female bird has to be drab. That's a survival strategy. If you're sitting on a nest, you want to be as inconspicuous as possible. So if you're putting on a museum display, it could be that one of the things that you want to do is to attract the attention of the public. And so if you have a whole series of very drab birds in your glass box, people aren't going to stop and look. Whereas if and that could be one explanation, but it's also possible that there are other explanations for that gendering. So that's something that I look at. You also mentioned the Legge and the public, and Legge does say, and I was very struck by this when I read A History of the Birds of Ceylon, he wants to encourage, well, it's not quite clear to me now who exactly he wants to encourage. He wants to encourage Ceylonese, I'm not sure if that's even the term that he uses, maybe, to take up the study of ornithology, and he hopes that this book will help them do that. And that's how I first interpreted it, that he meant Sri Lankans. I looked at the list of people who subscribed to the book, because it's sold by subscription. It's not sold in the bookshops. There are only 2 Sri Lankans who subscribe to the book, just 2, right? The majority of people in Sri Lanka who subscribe to the book are expat Brits, right? They are coffee planters, or they are colonial civil servants, or something like that. And in retrospect, I am wondering if when Legge talked about Ceylonese, he was actually meaning people resident in Ceylon as opposed to people native to Ceylon. That he was hoping, I mean, he might have wanted to encourage, Sri Lankans to do this. But it's interesting that among all of the people that he corresponded with, and he was an assiduous correspondent, he really had an enormous network of, a relatively large network of people in Sri Lanka with whom he was writing letters, trading stuff about birds, all of that. There aren't any Sri Lankans mentioned. Right, the only Sri Lankans who are mentioned are people who own property, who allow him to go onto that property to shoot something. And I'm pretty sure if there had been Sri Lankans who were interested in birds, in terms of the class of people who are members of the Royal Asiatic Society, for example, right, the anglicized Sri Lankans, that he would have found them, because he had all the time in the world. He was also the secretary of the Royal Asiatic Society for a couple of years. So I'm wondering if the public that he is referring to is a different kind of public to the public that I thought he was referring to when I first read the book. On the other hand, Layard actually holds Kellart up. Before the two seem to have fallen out, early in their acquaintance, he holds Kellart up as an example to what he calls his apathetic countrymen, who are clearly Ceylonese, Sri Lankans, and not Europeans, to take up natural history. So I'll sort of leave it at that. There's a lot of stuff materially, in the questions that you asked me, and thank you very much for that, because it's really going to give me stuff to think about.
Great, thanks, Arjun. I think in the interest of time, we will go directly to Nancy's the second response from Nancy. And then we can have a more sort of general discussion with questions from the audience at the end of that. So Nancy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Am I on? I am. Good. I can make my comment a little shorter as well, but I want to start by saying thank you. Thanks to Arjun for this interesting paper. Thanks for this opportunity, and I'm pleased to meet all of you. I'm an historian of Africa, of Southern Africa, and I don't think I really know anyone here, so I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk. Let me say that Arjun's goal in this paper, which he meets very well, is to complicate the diffusion in Basaya's model by foregrounding scientific production within the colony. Indian and Sri Lankan societies did not receive ornithology from the metropole. They participated in its creation. What he hasn't talked about in the talk today, but which he goes into the paper, is he establishes this through an idea from Bruno Latour of the center of calculation. Now, a center of calculation, according to Latour, is an information gathering institution where scientific knowledge is consolidated. And in colonial science, the centers of calculation are recognized usually to have been in the European metropolitan capitals. But what's important in this paper is that Arjun is showing the importance of a scientific center in what Basaya thought was a periphery, Calcutta. So he's dealing with Calcutta as a center of scientific calculation and showing how knowledge about an even more remote area developed in relationship to this center. What I also like about, so I'll say that, and I'll return to that in a bit. What I also like about this paper is it reconstructs the work of establishing a scientific field. We learn about technologies and the economic and social context of collecting. We learn which reference works were available to the research. Fine-grained accounting of the work is very well done, very interesting. But most important, which has also drew my attention, is his consideration of the network of workers, not just the work, but the workers who do it. He's laid out how a set of men of particular social positions produced a regionally based body of knowledge. And I appreciate the clear and deft depiction of this network of ornithologists. Live is at the center, receiving facts in Calcutta. Layard is the main actor in Sri Lanka, and he's collaborating with Templeton and collaborating and clashing with Kellard. And Legg, who didn't get much attention in the talk today, is the last to arrive, and he consolidates all of this local production and he launches into the wider world with a publication. He does that from London. He works in London before he launches this final publication, and it's published in London, but it conveys this body of knowledge that had accumulated in Calcutta and of course, ornithologists, meaning people who were recognized as scientists, were not the only workers. And I applaud the attention to indigenous rural collectors. Mutu is depicted with attention and care, and I find this illustration of the oriental pied hornbill and Mutu's differentiation of it from local species to be really convincing. I think it's really convincing that he's thinking according to European ornithological Linnaean species concepts, which is a really peculiar thing and has to be learned. It's certainly not at all a universal way of looking at birds, and Mutu is using that language in those ways. So through its emphasis on some degree of hybridity and also by decentering knowledge collection from Europe to Calcutta, this research has put the colonial back in colonial science. Ornithology was not gifted from the imperial metropole. It's defined by those who are interacting in Sri Lanka. It's a local phenomenon involving mostly Englishmen with some indigenous Sri Lankan participation. And once again, I'll say historians of science in other contexts should take note of Mutu and how well drawn he is and how important he is to this story. It's always frustrating though for historians because those who we really want to read about are not represented as fully in the archives. And perhaps this is something also that Arjun could comment on. So once again, this science is led by Europeans. It's colonial yet hybrid. It's not strictly alien. So as for a topic of discussion, I'd like to return to something that Sujit touched on as well. I want to say that this is of a colonial, but not really an imperial science. And I want to ask how this understanding of the roots of ornithology in Sri Lanka might contribute to this current preoccupation in academia with decolonizing knowledge, not just science, but decolonizing knowledge. I know in Africa, in South Africa, and sometimes in universities in discourses among students, there's a drive really to remove identifiable colonial origins from academic knowledge. Now, I do not know about the state of this conversation in in Sri Lanka or anywhere else in South Asia, but Arjun's at an American liberal arts institution, and I know his students are probably thinking about it as much as mine are. So I'd like to suggest that the nuanced historical reading that we've been given today has a lot to contribute to these discussions about decolonizing knowledge, what that might look like, what that might mean. And I would like to ask Arjun to comment on that. So Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks for that, Nancy. Thanks very much for your comments. And of course, it's your work in Birders of Africa that has really pushed me to sort of think about people like Mutu and be oriented to people like Mutu. And it's frustrating because I'm very much interested in Mutu. I mean, he's a fascinating person. The few glimpses that I've been given of him in Layard's writings, which is one of the reasons why I do wish that Layard's correspondence with Blythe had survived, because I'm sure there would have been stuff about Muthu in it. And this is generally true, actually, in terms of the archive. The archive for this chapter and for my chapter on leg has been very slim. There is no collected archive. I've spent about 8 years trying to hunt down a leg archive in both Australia and in the United Kingdom, and it has not turned up anything except scattered letters here and there. And yet leg, even more than Layard, is a very important figure in ornithology, not just for the work he did in Sri Lanka, but in Australia. When he returned home to Tasmania, he helped to found the Australasian Ornithological Union, and he was its first president. You know, so I've always thought that somebody of that stature, his papers would have been saved somewhere, but apparently not. So I think it's through that kind of material, kind of the letters home, the field notebooks, things like that, that we probably could get more insight into people like Muthu. Kellart doesn't talk about local people or the work they do at all, right? I mean, in his writings. Layard does with respect to Muthu. Legg does. Legg has a lot of references to local people, but he doesn't really explore anybody in any detail. So yes, so there's an archive there, or perhaps there are other ways of trying to get at this, and perhaps a more experienced historian than myself. I'm, after all, an anthropologist interloping into the domain of history here, and so maybe historians, you know, may have suggestions for how one might do about this. The colonizing thing is very interesting because that's really a hot topic in ornithology right now. In just birding, that's following on the protests over the killing of George Floyd. So that's one of the spin-offs, right? So along with the fact that, you know, people are protesting against statues that are put up to prominent people from the past who had an unsavory history, protests have also been made, and organizations like the National Audubon Society are thinking very seriously about this, against the fact that many of these colonial ornithologists had thoroughly unsavory reputations, including Audubon himself. He was a slave owner. He was someone who, you know, after the Battle of San Jacinto in the Texas War of Independence, he went around the battlefield decapitating dead Mexican soldiers so he could send the skulls off to people who were into this new science of phrenology, whose the purpose of which was to establish that the white race was superior to all other races. So, you know, that's Audubon's past. And so the question arises, should we be naming birds after Audubon, like Audubon shearwater? So that is, you know, if you look up decolonizing ornithology, that's the kind of story that you'll find. And that's easy enough to do if what you're talking about is the common name for birds, right? You don't have to call it Audubon shearwater, you can call it something else. It becomes a lot more complicated if you want to change the scientific name of birds, because scientific names are governed by international agreement. So it's not just the local people in North America, but everybody's got to come on board. That creates real problems because there's a real protocol of scientific naming. But there's another way to think about decolonizing. And I think that goes back to Basaya, because if you think about Basaya's third phase, he doesn't call it decolonizing science, but essentially what he is suggesting there is in fact a process of decolonization, where science in the so-called periphery cuts its ties to or its dependence on science in the metropole and becomes its own thing. And where ornithology is concerned, for example, I'd say this has happened in India. It's kind of reached fruition in India. India has its own institutes, its own journals, its own scientific cadre. They are talking about India. They are oriented to India. They are not oriented to what's going on at the American Museum of Natural History. Sri Lanka is not quite there, but I would say in the last 20 years, Sri Lanka has made tremendous strides. But colonial science endured in Sri Lanka well into the 1970s. And it's only in the late 70s, early 80s that that situation began to change. I'm talking about that in my book as well. Let me just say one last thing about, so one last observation about this business of colonial science and decolonizing science is that there is a debate in Sri Lankan ornithological circle about whether birds that have traditionally had the word Ceylon as a prefix to indicate their endemicity, to say that this bird is found only on this island and nowhere else, like the Ceylon jungle fowl, whether that should be changed to Sri Lanka. And there are two schools of thought on this, and they divide in terms of their relationship to the colonial era. So the organization that emerges out of the colonial era wants to hold on to Ceylon. And the organization that has nothing to do with the colonial era, but was founded long after that era ended, wants to go with Sri Lanka. Right. So I will stop there. That were great questions, and give other folks an opportunity to raise stuff.
Great, thank you, Arjun. So we have a number of questions in the chat. I think first I will ask Prabhu. You've raised a few questions in the chat, but would you like to just kind of pose them verbally for Arjun?
Sure. Thank you, Arjun. That was most interesting. There is a huge amount of sensitivity among native Sinhalese Buddhists in their religious tradition about the evil of killing birds, particularly birds. So I wonder if this might have been like a taboo, where in an era before photography, you had to kill the bird in order to study it, whether this would have deterred them from participating in this sort of project. My second question was about, I see a couple of articles in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society about bird law. And often the writers refer to the fact that they learned this law from native people as they traveled around and so on. So I wonder how that informed your study.
Yeah, great question. And I think the answer to that is it depends on which Sri Lankans you're talking to. So the idea that being a Buddhist or being a Hindu is somehow precludes you from killing birds, I think, has no foundation in kind of the empirical situation, right? So one thing, if you read Layard and read Legg and people like that, you know that Sri Lankans are hunting birds. They are killing birds. Muthu is killing birds. The collectors who work for people like the taxidermists I mentioned are killing birds. So that that is true. But it's also true that there are other Sri Lankans who, for religious reasons, don't kill birds, all the way from back then to the present. So, for example, I did field work in Jaffna with Tamil school children because I was interested in following up on their experience. The field ornithology group of Sri Lanka, right after the war ended, had a project in the Singharaja rainforest, which they called Reconciliation Through Birding. And they brought kids from Jaffna and kids from Colombo schools together, put them into the Singharaja forest, spent 3 days going around and learning about birds. And I wanted to, so then I went to Jaffna after that was over and met with the children who had come down to Singharaja. I was in Singharaja with them. I followed them later on to Jaffna. And I discussed this with them. And I put the question that you just asked me to these children. And they were, all of them, adamantly opposed to the idea of killing birds in order to study them. And they would cite religious reasons for doing that. So, so I hope that sort of helps to answer that question. What was the second part of it? I think your question had two parts, right, Prabhu?
Yes, I was asking if articles published about bird law
yes,
have any relevance to your study. Yeah.
Yes. So in the sense that these stories are being collected by Legg, certainly by Legg. I'm trying to remember if Layard repeats stuff about bird law. I can't quite remember. Well, the reason this struck me is, Legg recounts some of this law, and he recounts it with relation to specific species. So he would say, there is a story about the Indian pitta, or there is a story about the scaly-winged thrush that people in this region tell me. And the question that occurred to me when I was reading that material is, how did he and those people determine what the identity of the bird was, right? Is it simply by describing the bird to them, or did he have a skin of the bird in front of him that he could show them and ask them, what do you know about this? And then they told him this bit of law. But yeah, he is in fact collecting this, and clearly he has some kind of relationship with these people. And I should also mention that both Layard and Legg, Layard, I think for sure, I think Layard knew Tamil and was reasonably conversant with it. And I think Legg may have known Sinhala as well, because Legg was apparently a gifted linguist who got the prize for German at Woolwich, and who had been beaten out for the prize for French because the guy who won it had been raised in France, so he had an advantage. So they could talk to people, and they were in fact talking to people. Perhaps it was through interpreters. But yeah, bird law does show up in these accounts.
Thank you, Arjun. Next, I will turn the floor over to Jonathan. You have a question?
I've got a question that might not go anywhere, and then I've got a sort of slightly off the wall one, which will at least entertain. The question that may not go anywhere, when you hit those early slide with the illustrations, I immediately started thinking of this wonderful exhibition at the Wallace Collection about 2 years ago that William Dalrymple curated, of work commissioned by the East India Company, very high proportion of which was natural history illustration in the 18th and early 19th century, but where the artists were often trained in Mughal techniques. So you got this extraordinary fusion of emergent scientific illustration with the kind of aesthetic that informed Mughal work. I'll put a link to the catalogue there. But what you were saying, it suggests like nothing like that happened in Ceylon, as it were. And I was wondering if that, apart from anything else, could simply be a product of scale, that in India it was possible to actually create a cadre of trained artists in the service of this emergent kind of colonial knowledge production, who in fact end up producing something which isn't exactly colonial at all. It's more, maybe in Chris Bailey's term, paracolonial or something like that. So that would be one question, would be just the absence of, I mean, there's these individual figures like Muttu and so on, but there's no like bigger community of practice such as you got in British India in the 18th and 19th century around illustration. The off-the-wall one was spotting the name of Hikaduwa Simangala in this catalogue of people you can contact. And I was trying to imagine, did anybody ever ask him to go and, skin a bird or something? I actually have him down as a kind of Nabokovian butterfly collector, out in the Pansila garden with his net trying to get butterflies. But it would be wonderful if you could find some evidence of Sumangala's maybe sideline in taxidermy or something like that.
I don't think Sumangala is there for his interest in birds. That's a very broad-ranging address book. I think Sumangala is there for anybody, say, who's interested in sort of anthropological stuff or that kind of material, not birds. I'd be fascinated if I could find evidence that Sumangala was interested in birds. And even if he was interested in birds as an ornithologist at that era, he would need to be skinning them. He would need to be collecting them, and that creates certain philosophical issues, right? The art thing is, there's Peter de Bevier, and he's the only artist that we know of in the pre-modern period. But interestingly, seeing that you bring up the question of art, one of the challenges to 20th century ornithology on the Indian subcontinent is the lack of adequately trained artists to illustrate the new field guides, right? So after Roger Tory Peterson in 1934, bird books went off in a very different direction. To the one, you had these things called field guides. I'm sure you are familiar with them, which have illustrations of birds, schematic, but very accurate in terms of proportions and color and so on. And that becomes the way to identify birds, so that you don't need to shoot them anymore. You don't need to depend on skins anymore. And one of the things that really handicapped people like Salim Ali, for example, in India, who was very prolific in producing these kinds of books, was the lack of indigenous talent that could illustrate them accurately. So some of Salim Ali's early books in the 1940s and so on are illustrated by British artists. They're actually illustrated by the person I think is probably the best bird artist Sri Lanka produced, who was G.M. Henry. And G.M. Henry, who was one of these country bottled Englishmen, he was born on a tea estate. He lived most of his life in Sri Lanka. He never had a formal education. He was educated at home by his older sister. He was a fantastic bird artist, and he produced the best, in my opinion, one of the best bird books on Sri Lanka besides Leg, Guide to the Birds of Ceylon, where a whole generation of Sri Lankans cut their, myself included, cut their teeth learning the birds. And he also illustrated Salim Ali's books, and his son, who was also a great bird artist, illustrated Salim Ali's book. So it was challenging to find good bird artists in the 20th century. Whatever their existence in the 19th century, they were in short supply in the 20th.
Thanks. I think Sujit had a quick question about the skull collection that you mentioned.
I've asked questions already, so maybe somebody else can ask. I mean, I don't mind asking about skull collection, but maybe there are others who'd like to come in.
Sure. Well, then we'll I think next up, Alex, I think you had a question about the Sandesha poetry.
Yeah, my question is really just to follow up on Sujit's point. So I'm going to force Sujit to ask a question anyway by reiterating his question, which is whether or not you think you could possibly use these descriptions of birds in Sandesha poems as evidence for a pre-colonial sort of antecedent to observation of birds, because they do contain very accurate descriptions of the color of the plumage of the birds, even the color of their feet and their beaks. And what's particularly fascinating is that the metaphors they use to describe these colors are often drawn from other portions of the natural world, especially flowers, to evoke the colors. And another interesting coincidence is that the time period you're working with was also a period when Sandesha poems were undergoing a sort of revival. There were a lot of new compositions of Sandesha poems in the 19th century. So just wondering what you think about that.
I think that is almost certainly a very good source to think about how Sri Lankans thought about birds, or at least how literary Sri Lankans thought about birds in the pre-colonial period. It's not an area that I'm very expert in, so it's something that I have to do a lot more reading on. But from what little I've read about Sandesha poems, I think that they do provide this kind of material. And one of the questions I've been struggling with is, besides the Sandesha poems, which is sort of a high literary tradition, is what kind of literature might exist in Sinhala, for example, in which birds are discussed, or in which natural history, what we might call natural history, is discussed. I've gone through the lists of what was printed in the 19th century, and most of it seems to be religious material. And I'm not a religious studies scholar or anything like that. I don't claim any kind of expertise in that area. And so I kind of wonder whether religious material has anything to do with, with nature.
Thanks. Takshila, I think you had indicated a question here in the chat.
Well, listening to Arjun's fascinatingly detailed presentation on the history of ornithology in Ceylon and Sri Lanka, I'm wondering what are some of the salient features that make the history of ornithology unique to histories of other disciplines of zoology on the island? And I'm wondering, for example, if Edward Blythe's, the connection he makes between Calcutta and Ceylon, perhaps is that one. I'm also thinking about this because even today, the Western Ghats and Sri Lanka are categorized as a single biodiversity hotspot. I have a second question too, which is not that well formed, but this is to do with the opening up of forest land to plantation economy that makes these birds accessible, as Arjun was mentioning in his presentation. Interestingly, this is also a period that does a lot of disruption in terms of ecology. And so it's fascinating that on the one hand, the opening up allows us to have a textual record of non-human species in the area, at the same time that serious disruption is taking place. So how do we kind of understand that moment and plantation economy? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I'm going to try to take the first part of your question, and then I'll circle back to the second question. What makes ornithology fascinating, and I think what initially got me into this project, which has sort of expanded beyond that, to become a kind of examination of the relations between professional scientists and amateurs, is that I think ornithology, and there may be a handful of other sciences, but I think ornithology is certainly one of the most significant ones, is one of those sciences where the contributions of amateurs, people who aren't professional scientists, people who aren't paid to do this kind of work, looms very large and is actually critically important. So that if you didn't have those amateurs, the science would take a very different shape, right? And that's true all the way from the period that I've just described to you, all the way up to the present, where amateurs do the bulk of the legwork, of the field work necessary for the scientists to construct their theories and their, their models and so on and so forth. And concomitantly with that fact, the fact that the walls between science and culture are porous because of this fact of the preeminent role of amateurs, I also argue that ornithology as a science is shaped by, to a greater degree than, let's say, chemistry or physics or mathematics, which, are much more impervious to this sort of thing, is shaped by the cultural context in which that science has been embedded, right? If Sri Lankans are doing ornithology, they're going to be doing it in a somewhat different way to the way they do it in the United States, or the way they do it in England, or the way they do it somewhere else. So that's one of the reasons I find that ornithology an interesting way to think about the kinds of questions that I want to ask. With the business of the destruction of forests, well, I'm not sure that, and I found no evidence that my characters, Layard and Legg and Kellard, were unduly disturbed about the destruction of forests. And I think part of the reason is that at that period in the 19th century, Sri Lanka, despite the destruction of forests in the hills, Sri Lanka was basically a forested island. It had extensive forests. It said that you could walk from Dondra Head to Point Pedro without ever leaving the jungle, right? I don't know if you recall from the slide I put up about Legg, that the southeast quadrant, right, what is Uva and the east coast, that quadrant was quite unexplored. There were no blue pins dropped in there. And that's because there were no roads there. And so the zoology of the southeast quadrant of Sri Lanka was unknown or very poorly understood into the 20th century because of the lack of roads. And it was all forested. So I don't think the forest issue would have meant very much to these people in that era.
Prabhu, I see you have another question.
Yes. Have you ever looked at the collection of watercolors by Jan Brandes? I hope I'm pronouncing that last name right.
No,
where
This is
there have
beautiful.
been, yeah, I mean, there are some pictures, very detailed, very finely worked pictures of birds with notations. So I wonder if Professor Neera could speak to that.
I've never even heard of Jan Brandes, I'm sorry to say. So thank you for telling me about him. But I might add one thing about paintings and their use in ornithology that I didn't mention, and I meant to. I had a picture of Lowton's sunbird, I think, in one of my slides. I meant to talk about it. When Blythe wrote to Layard, he would write saying, I'm interested in these birds. Can you get me specimens? Can you find out where in Sri Lanka they occur, and so on. And one of the ways he would convey what kinds of birds he was interested in is by paintings, little miniature paintings. And I put one of those up. Those were by an Indian bird artist named Kuliludi, about whom we know very, very little. But Kuliludin painted these things. Blythe sent them to Layard, and I assume Layard returned them to Blythe because they all ended up in the British Museum of Natural History in the collection of Sir William Jardine, who was a well-known naturalist of the 19th century.
Hey, well, I think we're out of time, so it's time to close this seminar. Thank you very much, Arjun, for your talk, and thank you also to Nancy and Sujit for your very interesting comments. And thank you to everyone who has attended not only this seminar, but the entire series. So this is the last of the series of 6 seminars. This was the second series. We did one earlier this year. We do plan to do a third series, which will begin probably the last week of February or possibly the first week of March. And we'll have another 6 seminars with the idea of finishing before the New Year's holidays in Sri Lanka in April. So I hope to see many of you at that series. And I would also like to thank Pusadi for all of her work with the logistics of the seminar and organizing it. She would normally be speaking now, but she's feeling quite unwell today. But from her bed at home, she's still behind the scenes ensuring that the seminar has continued. And I'd also like to thank Phil Friedrich for his role in the seminar series. So hope to see many of you again at the end of February.
Thank you, John. Thanks for the invitation to be part of this.
Yeah.
Thank you all.